I'm Amanda Borth, and as was mentioned, I'm an associate researcher here at the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes. So what that means for the context of my presentation is I'm primarily responsible for the data collection and data analysis around our participatory technology assessment projects, which we'll be hearing about a lot today. And just to better contextualize my background in the context of this presentation, as you know, I have a background in global environmental policy as well as science and climate change communication. So much of what I'll be talking about today related to our PTA or Participatory Technology Assessment work will have a communication focus, and I'll provide some examples from our climate-related participatory technology assessments. So for our session today, you've been learning a lot about the how-tos of citizens' assemblies. And I'll be going over CSPO's participatory technology assessment work that draws from and kind of reshuffles the characteristics of citizens' assemblies into public engagement for science and technology decision-making. So PTA, or Participatory Technology Assessment, captures a suite of methods that brings public, expert, and policymaker perspectives into deliberation with one another around science and technology issues. And my focus particularly today will be the piece of that PTA process that integrates community and stakeholder perspectives into the designs of our actual deliberations. So that leads me to our objectives for today, or at least for this session. The first is to explore how PTA integrates community and stakeholder perspectives into science and technology deliberation design. And we'll achieve this by working on understanding the why, the what, and the how of PTA, specifically with a focus on its open framing process. So we'll achieve that through our first piece of the session, which is the presentation, where I'll describe the why of PTA, then move into what exactly PTA is, so really breaking down its ins and outs, and then how to conduct open framing, which is one particular piece of the PTA process. And then, as you're all familiar with, we'll move into some Q&A, some table work, and then finally a plenary discussion to close things out before lunch. So let's start off with the presentation component and why PTA. So why is science and technology policy a unique case for engagement? And I'll kick things off with a little bit of background information just to provide some additional context. PTA, as I described a little bit before, is an engagement model that seeks to improve the outcomes of science and technology decision-making through dialogue with informed citizens. So we're engaging groups of non-experts who are representative of the general population, but typically are not included in science and technology policymaking, particularly here in the US. So PTA is both similar and different to citizens' assemblies. So I mentioned it takes some of its characteristics and reshuffles it into a little bit of a different method. So one of the obvious differences is that PTA specifically focuses on science and technology issues. But in addition to that, rather than having public experts and decision makers in direct communication with one another, what we do in PTA is a process for facilitating that communication, but also creating open spaces for each of those actors to communicate with one another in a way that reduces the influence of the other actors, to have more open and authentic perspectives emerging from each of those different actors. So why do we want to conduct PTA in the context of science and technology policymaking and decision-making? First is that questions of science and technology policy are also social values questions. So that means answering these social values questions is not just in need of science and engineering knowledge, but also in need of the lived and living knowledge of societies. So this is the broad overarching concept for why we do PTA on science and technology issues, and here I'll exemplify it in a little bit more detail. The image that you see on this screen is a wheel that shows the stages of science and technology governance and policy, where when it comes to the innovation of science and technology, it goes through three broad phases. The upstream, where governance asks, what research and development should be authorized. If it should be authorized, then we have the midstream, which is how to implement research and development, and then finally downstream, whether to adopt research and development. So here on the next side of my screen, there's some public engagement questions that are associated with each component on this wheel. For the upstream or research phase of science and technology innovation, public engagement can help us answer should we or should we not conduct research. Then in the midstream or the development phase of science and technology, public engagement can help us answer if we should conduct this research, then how should we go about doing so? And then finally, in the downstream or deployment phase of technologies, how do we maximize the benefit when we deploy these technologies and minimize its harms to society and the environment? So with that context in mind, let's dive into what exactly PTA is in a bit more detail by going through more of its definition as well as an overview of the activities that we've done at CSPO and with ECAST in the past, which is our expert and citizen assembly of science and technology. So as a quick reference, I've put a few resources on your tables, and we have extras, don't worry if you want some. So you'll see the first example is of our solar geoengineering PTA project, which is in this red folder. And then the other one is an example of our PTA from NASA's asteroid detection. And then finally, I know quite a few of you are familiar with the Democracy in Hotter Times. Chapter 5 from David Gustin goes into PTA as well. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that before we dive into the ins and outs of PTA. So here on the one side of my screen, I have some characteristics of what PTA is. First, it bridges participation and expertise in a distributed, agile, and collaborative way that is institutionally nonpartisan, and we are inviting and integrating diverse value perspectives. Another key component is that our PTA process is continuously innovative and its concepts and its practices. So basically what that means is that, as I'll show you today, PTA has a few core pieces of its process, but exactly how we go about that from project to project is very responsive to the particular policy and technology context that we're in. So when we go through each of the 3 phases that I'll describe later of PTA, what goes into each of those 3 phases is adaptable to the particular needs of the context that we're in. And then finally, we look to integrate policymaking, wider societal deliberation, and technological research and development. So here we can see from our ECAST network a few examples of the types of PTAs that we've done in the past. And there were some questions about public engagement on the federal level. Particularly, our PTA work has been conducted in collaboration and in support of decision-making done at the federal level. So you can see we have, for example, NASA, NSF, NOAA, here in the US. And we've done a variety of different topics, including driverless cars, gene editing, nuclear waste, and so on. So we say that PTA is a multi-purpose gap filler. So what exactly does that mean? There's a few different gaps that we're looking to fill. First is a democratic gap. So we're looking to continue to evolve democratic participation in science and technology decision-making. Socio-technical, so bridging expert and professional judgments with what society cares about to strengthen the link between science and society. Public values, so that we're making sure we start to better integrate public values into the questions that are being asked of science policy and the policies that are being enacted and written up. And then finally, bridging knowledge gaps so that the questions that are being asked of science policy are not just those born from experts, but also born from lived and living knowledge of societies. So before I dive into that 3-phase process of PTA that I mentioned, you'll be hearing me talking about a few different actors. And I just want to showcase how exactly we conceptualize these actors at CSPO and within the ECAST network, drawing from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine diagram in one of their reports. So at large, we have publics, which are groups of people who contribute to democratic decision-making, but may lack direct connection to the science and technology issue we're deliberating about. Then we have expert stakeholders, which are people with direct professional or personal interest in the S&T topic. And then finally, communities, which are groups of people who live in or near the research, development, or deployment of science and technology topics that we're discussing in our PTA. So moving on to the PTA process, which is a 3-phase process, starting with a pre-deliberation phase, which we call framing and design, or sometimes open framing, which I'll be discussing a lot later. In this process, or piece of the process, we recognize that so often in deliberations, the agenda of that deliberation is typically set by experts and policymakers. Here, we're trying to break down what exactly we're asking and what exactly we're doing in our deliberation by integrating the perspectives, needs, and values of experts, stakeholders, policymakers, and communities in an open framing process. We go through this through a variety of different methods, typically through a literature review of expert scholarly and gray literature on the science and technology topic, community dialogues to understand community hopes and concerns around an S&T topic, individual stakeholder interviews, and a design workshop with stakeholders where they can reflect on how exactly we should design a deliberation in order to best meet the needs of society and the actors that could use the outcomes of these deliberations. So we take all of this to inform the content and protocol development of our deliberation, the recruitment and training of our facilitators and other actors involved, and then we conduct citizen deliberation forums. And then finally, after all of this, we take the results from our deliberations and we integrate them into the needs of particular actors where they are most usable. So we go through some preliminary results, do a results workshop, create reports and briefings, which you have on your table, and we also do some education and training. Now, as we go through each of these 3 phases, there's a few characteristics that tie them all together that are probably also familiar to you as you've been learning about and working on citizens' assemblies. So first is we strive for diverse representation, then deliberative, multi-directional learning, informed community participants, as well as clear, comparable, and usable outputs, formats, outcomes, and evaluations. So, as I've been trying to emphasize, I'll be focusing on this first component throughout the rest of my presentation, as I'm sure that's probably the newest idea to all of you in the room, as you've been talking a lot about the deliberation phase through the Citizens Assembly School. So here's just a quick example of what these 3 phases look like in the context of a particular project. This one is our current ongoing project on carbon dioxide removal, which is a set of technologies that draw carbon out of the atmosphere and store underground long-term to address climate change. So here you can see, I won't go through all of it, but how we've taken each of the key methods and started to break them down and really design them in a way that is responsive to the needs of this particular project. So to wrap things up for this section about what PTA is, I'll go through its uses and outcomes. So each of these uses and outcomes can be different per different project based on the particular project needs and the audience needs. So first we have education, where the goal is enhancing the literacy of publics and their science and technology literacy on the topic that we're engaging them on. Next is decision support. So this is a decision-making tool for assessing public values, managing uncertainties, filling democratic gaps, and bridging democratic gaps. Next is supporting research, both the research agenda of the particular science and technology policy issue, but also conducting research on what works and doesn't work in terms of public engagement. And then finally, innovation. So enhancing the social capacity of people to engage in science and technology issues. So now we'll dive into that one component, which is open framing. So how do we conduct open framing? What does it look like? And what does it even mean? So for this, I'd like to go back to the basics of what framing even is. I know many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with framing and or use it a lot in your own lives. But when it comes to describing what open framing is and the role it has in deliberation, sometimes it's very useful just to go back to the basics and describe what framing even is and what it is not. So framing is the act of presenting information about an issue that highlights or increases the salience of a specific aspect of that issue. So here's a very basic but super useful example. First, there are many known and ready-to-use solutions to climate change. Second, more extreme weather events are an impact of climate change. Both of these statements are absolutely accurate about climate change, but they communicate different components of the climate change issue. The first is solutions-focused, and the second is impact-focused. And framing can have a variety of different functions. First, it helps us understand a problem definition of an issue, its causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment recommendation. Now, I really like this quote from Nisbet to understand what framing is not. Framing, it should be noted, is not synonymous with placing a false spin on an issue. Although some experts, advocates, journalists, and policymakers certainly spin evidence and facts. Rather, framing is an attempt to remain true to what is conventionally known about an issue. As a communication necessity, framing can be used to pare down information and give greater weight to certain considerations and elements over others. So, here's a quick example of why framing matters and what impact it can have. That's a very basic but kind of fun example. So here, if you were in a grocery store, which of these two options would you choose? The frozen yogurt that contains 20% fat or the one that contains 80% fat? Raise your hand if you want the one that contains 20% fat. Oh. Or is 80% fat free? I know, right? So who wants the 20% fat one? Who wants the 80% fat free? Okay, a lot more. Who wants both? Ah, okay. Right? So as you can see, both of these are basically communicating the same thing. Neither one of them are misinformation, but it's just saying the same thing, but in different ways, right? So my point here is that although framing can be useful for paring down, digesting, and communicating information, when it comes to the context of deliberation, the issue that we need to have in our mind is that when we apply framing, like in the case of the frozen yogurt and what you want to buy in the grocery store, it can impact our understanding of the issue and our behaviors toward the issue. So, what exactly then is open framing? In open framing, we're trying to peel back any expert framings toward an issue to allow participant framings to emerge. So just to reiterate that, it's a method which avoids opposing expert frames of an issue on participants and instead opens space for people to generate their own frames toward that issue. So here we have some photos of one of our open frame focus groups. That was from our carbon dioxide removal PTA that I mentioned, which is currently ongoing. So why do we care about open framing for science and technology engagement? First, we want it to, and hope that it does, empower people to form and share their own perspectives about an issue. Second, to gather local knowledge on an issue. Third, gain new insights into how an issue is understood. And then finally, for us as the designers of deliberation, to design responses to an issue that better meets the needs, views, and values of those affected and involved in the particular S&T issue. So now that you know a lot about what open framing is and kind of had a bit of a primer of how we go about doing it here at CSPO, here are some tools for doing open framing as a pre-deliberation step for stakeholder engagement, and then next I'll be discussing for public engagement. So for stakeholder engagement, our purpose of open framing is to understand the key issues and questions around an emerging set of technologies that need to be addressed in the minds of academics, NGOs, government officials, and other stakeholders. And particularly, we want to understand these stakeholder needs to ensure that we produce outputs that will actually be usable by these stakeholders in the real world to hopefully impact decision-making, as well as those other outcomes that I addressed. So some methodological options are, one, to determine the information needs for yourself as well as for stakeholders, conduct a literature review, one-on-one interviews, and a design workshop which engages stakeholders to provide insights on how they would like to see a deliberation on the topic conducted and what types of topics and questions need to be asked of publics. When it comes to public engagement, open framing for public engagement, our purpose here is to understand how members of publics make sense of a particular science and technology issue. So understanding their hopes and concerns, as well as their key values, and to determine how a deliberation can serve affected publics and communities. So some ways that we do this here at CSPO through our PTA is by determining which segment of the public we want to be gaining knowledge from, or what particular communities we want to be engaging with, going through recruitment, focus groups, and post-focus group interviews as well. So here's an example just to highlight what component of this flowchart I've been talking about related to a particular project, which is the CDR one. So here we have the problem framing phase, and then that feeds into our forum design and development directly through theme selection, how we design our sessions and content, how we design background information material, and how we go about the facilitation, recruitment, and data collection protocols. So with that, I know I gave you a lot of information, so I'd like to open it up to question and answer.